interpreted as firstly hinting at an assumed superiority of Western culture, amalgamated in what is called Western art music, such as symphonies. Secondly, in this phrase, humanity is split in a them and a we. And thirdly, the idea of a somehow superior value of written music is underlined, thereby indirectly dismissing other forms of music. As for example, Antonio Tommasini wrote in his Critics Notebook in the New York Times, and I quote, "Many commentators seized on the line as a clue to the president's thinking, his white nationalist dog whistling, as Jonathan Capehart, a columnist at the Washington Post, bluntly put it. Nothing impedes the appreciation of classical music and keeps potential listeners away more than the perception that it is an elitist art form that composers throughout history and their aficionados today uniformly consider it the greatest, loftiest, and most ingenious kind of music. Few classical music fans, in my experience," says Tommasini, argue that the Western symphonic repertoire stands apart from or atop music of other cultures or other types of Western music. But with just 3 words, Mr. Trump buttressed this unfortunate perception, end quote. This 3-word sentence and debates that followed it illustrate the effective political, cultural, and social presence of discourses around the status of music. Such debates are not exclusive for music, though. Other art forms and media, such as opera, theatre, film, TV series, books, or digital games, are similarly the subject of emotional or, in the worst case, even aggressive discussions. Those discussions can, for example, be conducted by social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or you name them, or in the commentary columns of newspapers and magazines, and believe me, they are not less vivid, let's put it that way. In the realm of digital games, the so-called Gamergate controversy is an infamous and very complex example, and I tried to make it short. So, self-appointed keepers of ethics in game journalism turned out to be participants of an online harassment campaign against female game developers Zoe Quinn and Brianna Wu, as well as feminist media critic Anita Sarkeesian and many others. Gamergaters wanted to put forward their idea of true gamer identity and culture. Further, Gamergate, which in some media has been even described as a culture war against digital games becoming more diverse and inclusive in terms of their content and target groups, became, in some cases, even closely interlinked with right-wing and alt-right political movements at the time who saw their chance to engage with specific social groups who they formerly believed were not political. Both examples, the Trump phrase and Gamergate, plus the following debates, turned on questions of cultural value, inclusion and exclusion, gatekeeping, prerogatives of interpretation and dominance in discourses. Which cultural and political values are assigned to which kind of games or musics? In which context can a certain game or music be performed, and is it considered as art or rather as a mass product? Who is allowed to play which kind of game or music in which spaces and when? Which kind of participation in music making or gaming are allowed to whom? In my talk today, I would like to provide an insight in some of the manifold ludomusicological discourses around politics of play and musical play, with a specific focus on digital games and games culture. And I stress digital games because there would be a lot to say also about board games or LARPing or whatever other gaming culture you can imagine. As I do not suppose that everyone is familiar with the field of ludomusicology, I'd like to start out with a quick introduction. So, what is this? What is ludomusicology? In a nutshell, ludomusicology is a sub-area of game studies. The field has started to pick up pace approximately 10 years ago, and is notably growing its body of publications since 2008. Additionally, organizational structures are starting to be established in the form of annual conferences and research groups. For example, beginning February, there will be the North American Conference to Video Game Music, and end of March, there will be our own conference of the Ludomusicology Research Group. Both of them will be hybrid, so if you're interested in the field, you can join them from afar, even if you are not able to join the conference wherever they take place. In 2016, some of these local groups founded the Society for the Study of Sound and Music in Games and also established a subject-specific journal in 2020, the Journal of Sound and Music in Games. So it's getting bigger, the field. So what is it that we are interested in? So ludomusicological research is interested in basically 3 main areas. Firstly, the study of music as a design element in games and music games as a specific genre, investigating the history, design strategies, or compositional practices, as well as developing subject-specific approaches and methodologies for the study of those games. Secondly, ludomusicology looks at the cultural and fan-cultural practices that evolved around games and their music, cultural interrelations with other media forms and musical genres, or best practices to use games in musical educational context, as we also have just heard in the debate outside. So this is also something that's discussed in ludomusicology. And thirdly, ludomusicology is also interested in the ways in which games and music can both be studied as playful and performative practices. Having a background in Theaterwissenschaft and performance studies, this last approach was also my entry point of choice when starting out in the field. Drawing on the theorization of scholars from the areas of performance studies, game studies, and musicology, my goal was to develop a theoretical framework that addressed both playing games and music as forms of performance. In addition, I wish to include practices of playing with games and their music in order to create performances. In doing so, the political aspects of both game and music performance quickly came into view. As for example, German Theaterwissenschaft scholar Erika Fischer-Lichte explains, one of the core features of performance is that a performance, in the sense of an Aufführung, the unique event that's happening only one time, is always a social and subsequently political event because, and I quote, in ihr, Klammern der Aufführung, geht es wie verborgen auch immer die Aushandlung oder Festlegung von Positionen und Beziehungen und damit Machtverhältnisse. In der Aufführung sind Ästhetisches und Soziales bzw. Politisches untrennbar miteinander verknüpft. Diese Verknüpfung entsteht nicht erst, wenn eine Aufführung politische Sujets behandelt oder politische Programme verkündet werden. Sie ist mit der leiblichen Kopräsenz gegeben und garantiert. End quote. Fischer-Lichte applies this idea exclusively to live performances, during which participants come together in a physical space, interact with each other, change roles, and constantly have also the opportunity to switch between the role of audience and performer. Following the reasoning of Edmund linguist Richard Bauman, performance scholar Martin Carlson further suggests that, quote, all performance involves a consciousness of doubleness, through which the actual execution of an action is placed in mental comparison with a potential, an ideal, or a remembered original model of that action. Performance is always performance for someone, some audience that recognizes and validates it as performance even when, as is occasionally the case, the audience is the self, end quote. That way, I suggest the negotiation of power, positions, and relationships in the sense of Fischer-Lichte can also happen when audience and performer are the same person. They do not perform and evaluate their own performance in a vacuum with no background, but against the backdrop of either the knowledge or unknowingness of related social contexts in the evaluation processes and discourses. Concerning the first field, music as design element in games, one can find musicological scholarship discussing the manifold political aspects concerning a game's sonic content, which is performed during gameplay. So when I perform the game, I also perform the music. This includes debates on, for example, stereotypical acoustic representations of cultures, social classes and subcultures, cultural appropriation, the use or misuse of songs or musical styles and tropes known from, or at least referring to real-life protest movements, political incidents, ideas or ideologies, and also changes of game music scores due to demand of censorship or cultural taboos. So this happens as well. Further critical discussion on collaborations between companies with musicians or voice actors that are marked by an imbalance of power can be found. Just recently we had a huge debate on the payment of voice actors in the games industry. In her chapter, Music History and Progress in Civilized Civilization 4, Karen Cook, for example, examines the use of music in the strategy game Civilization 4. In this game, players progress through historical eras, so to speak, have to successfully defend their in-game nation against others and win the game either by conquest, cultural domination, space race, or diplomatic victory. Cook notes that the score consisted of two soundtracks, quote, one for terrain gameplay or action taken on the main map and one for diplomatic discourse, end quote. Both scores changed their tune the more players progressed from the so-called classical era, the first era, towards modernity. While the classical era music was created by a team of composers specifically for the game, following their idea of a Stone Age or prehistoric music, in subsequent eras, music of composers such as Palestrina, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, and other Western composers is used. By closely analyzing both scores, so the game map score as well as the diplomatic screen score, and taking developer comments into account, Cook finds that, and I quote, As the game progresses through the subsequent game eras, subsequent to the classical era, the number of composers in each era dwindles, as does the number of compositions. The average length of each piece also grows from 2 or 3 minutes to well over 5 minutes over the course of the game. The diplomacy themes all also develop in similar ways, the instrumentation growing louder, larger, and more modernized. But it is a particular kind of progress, end quote. To characterize this particular kind of progress, Cook refers to statements of Dr. Jeffrey Briggs, at the time CEO and president of the games production company Firaxis Games, and involved in the composition of the classical era prehistoric-ish music, who explained on the publisher's website that after discovering music in the game, so you discover certain steps in human evolution during the game, and you also discover music at some point, players began hearing great music from history. As Cook points out, and I quote, "This great music has been chosen specifically and solely from the Western art music tradition. Regardless of which civilization the player has chosen to operate, the Terrain soundtrack is always the same. The oral representation of progress is thus only ever that of Western progress. The evolution of diplomacy themes also reinforces that narrative. Whether a pre-existing folk song, a Western composition, or a newly composed anthem, the theme progresses according to, brackets, presumed, Western standards of modernization, growing louder, more fully textured, and more rhythmically or polyphonically intricate," end quote. Drawing on findings by Diane Carr, who herself again builds on David Meyer's work, she critically discusses the question whether players were necessarily affected by or aware of such meanings, or would even internalize the, and I quote again, Western imperialist and cultural ideologies of the game as suspected by some game scholars. So there has been a huge discussion on these games before. On the side of the game's producers, Cook points out that musical choices were not necessarily made to convey the above-mentioned messages on purpose, but rather due to production contexts. So game creators also base decisions on game industry-specific production procedures, decision processes, or other aspects such as budgetary constraints. So, for example, creating a new score is way more expensive than just using classic from the Western art music repertoire. Given the circumstance that players can simply decide to mute the music and or listen to music of their own choice while playing the game, and apparently many do that, thereby deciding to not interact with those discourses and meanings, or even creating their own while playing the game, she concludes that, and I quote, "the fear that the game player will, by default, internalize Western ideologies is largely unfounded, at least with regards to stiff, forced oral components," end quote. In that regard, she conceptualizes the meaning generation processes between the game and its music, its creators, and its oral content and players during the actual gameplay performance, not as a one-way street. Players are not seen as passive audience who are helplessly subjected to music-related discourses and meanings created during the performative act of play. Instead, during a gameplay performance of Civilization 4, players act in roles of both audience and performer of the game and its music. By playing, they come in touch with meanings and discourses that musical choices made by the designers may evoke, but as I have suggested earlier, building on Carlson, they evaluate their performance against the backdrop of either their knowledge or also unknowingness of related social contexts and discourses, or even decide, consciously or unconsciously, to not interact with music at all by simply muting or changing it. This perspective on players as active participants in the creation or co-creation of music performances and processes of meaning generated during gameplay, is one of the cornerstones in ludomusicological writing. As Casey Collins already stated in her fundamental 2008 book Game Sound, quote, "Unlike the consumption of many other forms of media, in which the audience is a more passive receiver of the sound signal, game players play an active role in the triggering of sound events in the game," end quote. We've seen that during the last 2 days all the time. This circumstance becomes even more obvious in the specific form of music games, as we have already also seen. One game franchise that hit the market in the mid-2000s with its first installment sparked vivid debates, though, on the nature of this active role, Guitar Hero. As the marketing campaigns for the game announced, Guitar Hero offered players to unleash their inner rockstar. By pushing the same colored buttons and strumming the strum bar at the right moment on a controller in the form of a little plastic guitar, players allowed the pre-recorded guitar or bass lines of rock and metal songs to be replayed in the form of triggered sound events. As Kiri Miller, Roger Mosley, and many others have pointed out, Guitar Hero received much praise regarding its design and was lauded for bringing classic rock and the desire to learn the actual guitar to young people, whether this is. It's always something that's in the debate, to young people, kids, or whatever. At the same time, the game was also harshly criticized for its treatment of the music, particularly by rock musicians such as Jack White and Jimmy Page. Players were accused of finagling an experience they did not earn through years of hard work, sweat and tears, namely the experience of rocking out while at the same time producing an enjoyable or somewhat enjoyable acoustic rendition of a song they never learned to play, or at least they never learned to play on the real guitar. Feeling that cultural backlash, players were very quick to declare that, and I quote, they understand the difference between authentic musicianship and video game prowess, as Kiri Miller points out. While there would be a lot to unpack here, I'd like to highlight two questions which constantly came up in these debates around Guitar Hero and also the other important music game at the time, Rock Band. Are players allowed to perform, in this case, rock and metal music, and experience themselves as musically creative, while just pushing buttons to cause someone else's musical performance to resound? And more broadly, is this way of consuming music a post-adorno nightmare, as Miller also points out, the final stage of neoliberal capitalism that threatens the sanctity of music and the sincere work that is required to allow for active musical participation by turning the experience of rocking out or unleashing your inner rockstar into a commodified product that can be seemingly effortlessly consumed by everyone through a fake performance? There were many very effective debates around that. In this context, the theorization about music as performance is conducted by researchers such as Nicholas Cook, Christopher Small, Caroline Abati, and others come to mind. This discourse, in a nutshell, extends the reasoning about music and musical meaning beyond the primacy of textual works as objects of inquiry, and the notion that musical meaning is exclusively encoded in the written text. Instead, the idea of music being a performative and therefore both social and political art form is pursued. In his text Between Process and Product, Music and as Performance, Nicholas Cook consequently highlights that ideas about a certain piece or genre of music is to be, how a certain piece or genre of music is to be performed properly are subject to a constant social negotiation process between performers and audiences. While Cook still distinguishes between these groups, the aforementioned aspects of musical participation and music as a commodity are then again very prominently addressed in Christopher Small's concept of musicking in his same-named book. He defines the concept as follows, quote, "To music is to take part in any capacity in a musical performance, whether by performing, by listening, by rehearsing or practicing, by providing material for performance, what is called composing, or by dancing," end quote. He substantiates the need for the switch in perspective by assuming that participation in musical acts is not just of fundamental importance to our humanity, as he says, but that every human being is endowed with a capacity and thus entitled to participate. Quote, "If that is so, then our present-day concert life, whether classical or popular, in which the talented, or his quotation marks, in which the talented few are empowered to produce music for the untalented majority, is based on falsehood. It means that our powers of making music for ourselves have been hijacked, and the majority of people robbed of the musicality that is theirs by right of birth, while a few stars and their handlers grow rich and famous through selling us what we have been led to believe we lack." End quote. The concept of music king, therefore, involves a de-hierarchization of musical participation not only in terms of performers, but also in terms of recipients and creators. As a consequence, not only is everyone allowed to music in any capacity, but everyone is also allowed to talk about it and contribute to the discourse of shaping a common idea of how a certain piece of music or music has to be or can be performed properly, and even step into the role of a creator. The question of democratizing musical participation and, consequently, access to the means of musical production in order to become a creator is of specific interest in the third area of ludomusicological inquiry, the fan cultural practices, for which I have also brought an example. Thanks to the coming of affordable home computers and video game systems since the late 1970s, such as the Apple II, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the C64, or the Commodore Amiga, a participatory culture emerged, driven by an active and creative fan community. Practitioners in the so-called demo scene, from which then also the chiptune or chip music scene emerged, not just played the games, but also played with the games and the hardware. As game designer and scholar Eric Zimmerman puts this, quote, "Play is far more than just play within a structure. Play can play with structures. Being literate in play means being playful, having a ludic attitude that sees the world structures as opportunities for playful engagement," end quote. This aspect, being literate in play, is one building block of Zimmerman's concept of gaming literacy. Quote, "Gaming literacy is literacy. It is the ability to understand and create specific kinds of meaning." Zimmerman stresses that he explicitly names his concept gaming literacy, not game literacy or whatever else. Quote, "Because of the mischievous double meaning of gaming, which can signify exploiting or taking clever advantage of something. Gaming a system means finding hidden shortcuts and cheats, and bending and modifying rules in order to move through the system more efficiently. Perhaps to misbehave, but perhaps to change the system for the better," end quote. Through trial and error, and by hacking commercial products such as games or music-making software, home computers and consoles, and inventing their own program routines and software tools, hackers, demo sceners, and chiptune musicians gained several systems in that sense. Firstly, they continuously pushed the boundaries of the material they found to create their own artifacts and musical performances. Former players, therefore, stepped out of their roles as recipients and actors in games and took on the function of designers, in the sense of Katie Zalen and Eric Zimmerman, who defined design as, and I quote, "the process by which a designer creates a context to be encountered by a participant, from which meaning emerges." Again, not mine highlighting, end quote. In order to do that, they need to be competent to playfully use the given material basis in such a way that they create their own meaningful context, which in turn can be understood and evaluated by other, or themselves, competent participants in the subsequent performance. But also another system was gained. In 1987, Carsten Nowarski had published his Ultimate Soundtracker, an Amiga music program, as a commercial software product. The program was hacked by Dutch demo programmer X-Terminator from the group Jungle Command. The name is already speaking, I think. He improved and then re-released it for free as Soundtracker 2 under his own name. As Johan Kotlinski explains, quote, "The most important change was that he made the play routine public so that anyone could incorporate Soundtracker songs into their own productions. It was a very shameless and illegal thing to do, but the fact is that it was the starting point for the Soundtracker revolution. Slowly, Soundtracker became the de facto standard within game programming and the demo scene," end quote. Further, during the 1990s, Soundtracker and its successors in combination with affordable second-hand Amiga hardware became an entry point into electronic music making to many musicians and music producers who could, for example, not have afforded to buy a studio. Something you can read in many interviews from musicians at the time that say, okay, without the Amiga, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to start out into electronic music making. Practitioners of the chiptune and demo scene shared the knowledge gained through gaming a system and provided accessible, self-made or hacked tools for the creation of music performances for free. That way, they engaged in the opening up of musical participation in the sense of small. The resulting music performances were also shared free of charge within the community, but increasingly via the internet and made available to others for use or further processing, thus undermining the commodified nature of music in other genres. In this respect, gaming system takes place not only in relation to the technical apparatus system, which they use to play, the hardware software, but practitioners also gain the usual rules of Western music production and economy by providing music and some of the means to produce it for free. There would be much more to say about this, but looking at the time, I like to conclude. Adopting a perspective on games and music as performative art forms brings to the fore the social and subsequently political dimensions during the act of playing them, also beyond the contextual treatment of political topics. When performing a game and its music, audience and performer are in most cases the same person. Their knowledge, unknowingness, or even active ignorance of social cultural contexts and discourses, as well as negotiations of power, shape their own evaluation of their performance. In addition, the political dimension of the democratization of musical participation can come into play, when, for example, guitar hero players on the one hand take their right to the experience of rocking out, but at the same time become entangled in the political economy of music and musical experience becoming commodified. Or when chiptune practitioners play with mass market products to create their own performances or game the logic of the music market. As we also heard yesterday, the kindergarten example, for those who were there, play is political. While I could not go into detail, I hope I could at least provide a quick overview on the manifold aspects and potential fields of investigation of the politics of musical play, and I'm now very much looking forward to comments, thoughts, and questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the speedy introduction into the beautifully complicated realm of the political in the context of music and gaming. Are there questions?
I also take comments, thoughts, critique, everything.
I mean, more time is needed to digest all that information. Maybe a question from my side. You now address very critical political issues. In the lecture before, we already dealt a little bit in the context of music pedagogy with the question of, you mentioned Adorno yourself, so the question of consumerism and the consumer behavior. So in the field of musicking, or in the field that you are looking at in your research, can you see trends, let's say, especially in the education at Musikhochschulen, at music universities? Are we getting more commercial or subversively commercial by including gamification, game structure?
Oh, that's a hard question. I don't know. I can't really say for sure. I mean, what I just recently discussed with my students was a text by Mario Dosal, who that was called "Consumerism Hero." So where he explained how guitar heroes sold out, and also rock bands sold out, in his view, by exaggerating it basically. So it's the idea behind that text was that selling out means that you that you offer a certain, how to say, a certain idea about the music that you show. So for rock and metal, you have those discourses about it's authentic, it's raw, it's oftentimes improvised, it's whatever you have in those discourses, and then they make the product and then they sell it, and then at some point they exaggerate it and they try to become the real thing themselves by making themselves pillars of rock and musical culture. And this is the point where consumers say, no, thank you, you are not the real thing. We know that you're not the real thing. And I think this is something that's also important for ideas of gamification, etc., that people are not as dumb as many think. So people realize, okay, this is supposed to be, this is work, but I put some points and high scores on it, and then it's supposed to be fun. No, it isn't, still isn't. So I think what we just now heard in the debate on music pedagogics and instrumentation is we have to take people and players and people who learn instruments, we have to take that serious. We have to not try to übertölpeln. What was that? No, I like the English word. We have not tried to offer them something that's not what it says it is. You know what I mean? That was a big detour, but that's what we are currently discussing in that regard a lot. So if you wrap avocado in a chocolate, you still have the avocado at the core. Maybe we can find ways to make the avocado more interesting, tasty, fun, whatever. So that's something that's debated a lot at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions now on chocolate and avocado? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that you are very active in the field of the young field of ludomusicology. I'm wondering, is this new field you now are discovering and looking at in the moment, is it also affecting in a way the methodology of musicology? So is somehow musicology itself ludified or gamified in a way of also in a discourse of maybe opening up in kind of interdisciplinary fields or artistic research field we heard this morning. So do you see a certain influence also on the subject and the discourse itself?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I see that a lot. I mean, ludomusicology started out with a group of musicologists saying, okay, we want to look into games, and then at some point coming to the aspect that, okay, I can analyze these scores, and it makes sense to like transcribe them and try to understand, okay, what do the composer do, what's going on, etc. But at some point you just bump into a brick wall. So for example, when you have like live-generated soundtracks or whatever, or when you ask the question, so what happens at the very moment when someone plays the game and the music is sounding, so it's not happening the same way every time you play the game, right? Because the player can always, as we have also seen a lot in all the performances and installations, players can always do something that wasn't expected. They can stay in a room for like, I don't know, 5 minutes or 5 hours and listen to the same song over and over again, or they can mute music, or they can hack to stuff, they can do whatever they want, right? So on the level of play, you have the problem that, okay, score analysis only helps you that far. I mean, this doesn't make it obsolete, on the contrary, it's absolutely helpful to see that kind of stuff, but opening up the field and see, okay, how can we understand music as a playful practice, as something that's happening in the moment, as a performative practice, etc. I think that was the initial starting point for many people to go into ludomusicology, and of course also the contextual issues like, okay, what does it mean when a certain music is chosen for a specific scene or whatever. But I don't know if it's necessarily changing musicology. I wouldn't say that, but it's a very interesting field where interdisciplinary thought comes together, and we play a lot with theory. that's what we do.